Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Our Children Can't Wait webinar series. In this second webinar, we will be discussing housing and school and community safety. At this time, I'll introduce CTS Executive Director and author and editor of Our Children Can't Wait, Dr. Joe Bishop, to introduce our speakers today.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, on this wet, cold Tuesday, wherever you are. Thank you, Caitlin. And we are excited to have you with us. As Caitlin shared, this is the second webinar in our series on the Our Children Can't Wait, the Urgency of Reinventing Education Policy in America series. So you're here for number 2 of 5. And again, the topic, integration, housing, and community safety, but even more importantly, how do these issues impact education and education outcomes for our young people? So last webinar in February, we talked about a number of core issues, which are chapters actually in the book. How do we address systemic racism in schools? Dr. Tyrone Howard talked about. What is the relationship between air quality and education outcomes or exposure to pollutants? So Sarah Graneski and Tim Collins spoke about those topics. And then we heard from Michelle Davis to talk about the benefits of healthy schools. And I want to remind you, that conversation, those slides are available on our website if you're curious, what did they talk about for the first webinar? So my name is Joe Bishop, lead author and editor for Our Children Can't Wait, the urgency of reinventing education policy in America. I'm also the co-founder, executive director for the Center for the Transformation of Schools. I want to thank our team at CTS for organizing today's conversation. And today really is about the core values of our center. Today is about the systems and structures that keep our kids from flourishing. And ultimately, how do we change the rules of the game so more kids have an opportunity to learn, can succeed? So while I have your attention, though, let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Caitlin. And we'll go to the next slide. So this is going to be a slide. I'm going to say it right now. So mark your calendar. So we have three more dates coming up. April 19th at noon Pacific, 3 Eastern. We're going to be talking about school funding and students experiencing homelessness as core policy issues. On May the 10th, we're going to be talking about youth organizing and the youth justice system and policy, and also the idea of policy for whom, I should say. On June 14th, our last webinar in the series, we're going to talk about our history, which is really chapter 1 of the book, and how it can inform how we think about policy today. So if you like what you hear today, and if you're interested in the conversation, please come back for more, register, sign up on the CTS website to hear more about not only the book, the podcast, but also this series where we bring together some of the leading experts in the country on issues that matter for our young people. You can go to ourchildrencan'twait.com with more information as well about the book and the podcast, even a summary of the chapters and chapter authors. And want to ask you last few things. Pick up the book on Amazon or from Teachers College Press. It's available online. Follow the podcast of the same name, Our Children Can't Wait, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It actually came out today, another episode. And we have 16 episodes. So we have a lot of content, a lot of amazing people who will share their stories as educators, scholars, researchers. So I encourage you to take that next step. But let's get back to the conversation today. So I am honored to have Megan Gallagher, who's a principal research associate for the Urban Institute and a national expert on issues of housing and education with us today. Megan's going to be talking about her chapter on housing as a core education policy issue. We're also going to hear from Professor Heather Reynolds. Heather is now at Empire State University. She's a professor of teacher education. She's also a national expert on a topic that is on the hearts and minds of a lot of parents, voters, educators, school safety, school and community safety. And we're going to have a conversation more specifically about the policies that we need to bridge these issues of housing and school and community safety. So next slide, please. And actually, I should say, on the topic of integration, So Erica Frankenberg from Penn State University is not going to be with us today, or her co-author, Jen Askew. Erica is out sick, but we didn't want to cancel today's conversation. But I want to encourage you to go to the podcast when we do talk about integration to listen more to Erica and Jen. Their chapter is not only amazing, but they're just, I don't know, the issues that they raise and think about integration as a core issue for our country. Megan Gallagher is going to get into some of these topics around housing, but I just want to encourage you to follow Erica and Jen in their work. So next slide, please. So I mentioned that this is the second in a series of webinars around the book. I gave you some dates to mark down. I'll share the slide again with the dates. Next slide, please. So the topics of Our Children Can't Wait, just to kind of bring you up to speed. There's a lot here, a lot to digest. First chapter, Our Children Can't Wait, really sets up the why. Why do we need a new way of thinking about policy in our country? Second theme, how do we make sense of how our history, which actually Megan and Heather are going to be talking about today, how our history can shape how we think about policy today, and kind of these structural central issues that have defined America, but have also, to a large degree, hurt young people and families, sometimes in school settings. Chapter 3 talks about making children a national priority. We talk about whose vision, who's the who behind policy, right? Policy for the whole child will be the topic of the last webinar. We talk about student health and learning, air pollution, and exposure to toxins and its impact on education. We're talking about integrated schools, housing, school and community safety, the justice system, youth organizing, students experiencing homelessness. And then last but not least, how do we reach the policies we need? So these issues, to a large degree, have been looked at in isolation, but this book is an opportunity to draw connections with more of an intersectional way of thinking about policy for our country and for our schools. Next slide, please. Thanks, Caitlin. Okay, so to start us off, here's the question, and here's kind of the driver for this entire book. The question, and if you want to write in the chat box or share with us, think in your mind, which has more influence on student achievement? Is it factors in the school, like the capacity of teacher, the curriculum, instruction, or quality of instruction? Or is it factors that happen outside the schoolhouse, like housing, like community safety, like environmental quality, the topics we've been talking about in this chapter? Which has more influence on student achievement? Next slide, please. What we know is that out of school factors, and actually, if you go to the next slide, Caitlin, I'm going to come back to this one. Thank you. Perfect. Out of school factors. So the area in orange, David Berliner at Arizona State has been doing this work for a long time. But what he has found, and many others, that student achievement can be predicted by out of school factors 2 to 3 times more than in school. So that's the orange area. Yet our dominant policy response in our country when it comes to education and education opportunity has been in the blue, in school, things that happen typically in the schoolhouse. So this orange is redefining the conversation today is redefining the orange, like housing, school, and community safety, and a topic you're going to hear over and over again. We're also not only redefining policy, but even thinking more expansively about what out of school factors are. So if you go back to the previous slide, Caitlin, thank you. So out of school factors, as David Berliner at Arizona State describes it, are 1, low birth weight and non-genetic prenatal influences on children, inadequate medical, dental, and vision care, often the result of inadequate or no medical insurance, food insecurity issues, environmental pollutants, which we talked about last webinar, family relations, family stress, and neighborhood characteristics, which you could argue is a broad theme for, or domain for, what Megan and Heather are going to be talking about more today. But I just want to set that context of in school, out of school. And I just want to reinforce something, though, before we jump into Megan's comments. The book is not about excuses or saying that in school does not matter. What we're saying, if you go back to the orange and blue, thank you, Caitlin. What we're saying is we need a both and strategy, not a either or. We've been so historically stuck in the blue. We have to do the blue and the orange, in school, out of school, together, right, as we move forward. And that's really the premise behind this book and why we've come together to write the book, and to push the envelope of how we think about policy in our country. Next slide, please. So I'm excited to welcome again Megan Gallagher, expert from the Urban Institute. Take it away, Megan.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks everybody. It is great to be here with you to talk about housing policy and practice, why it matters for educational outcomes, and how we can leverage it to support students. I am really so thrilled that Joe asked me to contribute to the book. It really represents policy and practice areas that we should be paying more attention to. My work over the past decade or so has revolved around the role that housing and neighborhoods play in education. And I'm really excited to talk with you about them today. If we go to the next slide, and even the next slide, my first slide is really about the housing affordability crisis that we're experiencing. This is a problem for renters and homeowners, but it is a much bigger problem for renters. And if we bullet out here a little bit, about a third of children live in rental homes, and about half of them spend more than 30% of their income on rent. A quarter spend more than 50%, and that is really leaving too little to cover basic needs. Renters are also faced with increasing rents and increasing eviction rates today. And homeowners are not immune to the crisis. Almost 2/3 of children live in homes owned by their families, and about 1/5 of those also spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Again, leaving often too little to afford to cover their other basic needs. Before we go to the next slide, the prevalence of these issues is higher among students of color, particularly Black students. And in the chapter, there's more content about the policies and practices that brought us to this point, but I would be happy to talk more about them when we get to the discussion. So the next slide, there really are 5 housing characteristics that we connect to education, and we often refer to them as the housing bundle. And so these characteristics are housing quality, housing affordability, housing stability, housing that builds wealth, and neighborhood quality. And Caitlin, if you could just click to show the bundle, it's really the thing that sort of holds it all together. Each of these characteristics is discussed in a lot more detail in the chapter, but I do want to spend a minute highlighting some of the evidence that links each of them to education. So low quality housing is associated with lower kindergarten readiness scores. And so Caitlin, if you could click once, it shows us that research. High rent burdens, so housing affordability, it is associated, so high rent burden, which means paying too much for rent, is associated with increased behavioral problems. Housing instability affects school stability, which in turn affect math and reading scores. Home equity can increase the likelihood of attending college. And then exposure to neighborhood violence can disrupt academic progress. So most of the research on housing attempts to distinguish the effects of housing from other drivers of educational outcomes. So you might be wondering, if you're a researcher, are these independent relationships? There have been some really good studies to look at the independent relationship between housing and educational outcomes. But it is, as you can imagine, really difficult to do because housing is so essential, right? But one of the things about the research that exists is that it often looks at these characteristics one by one, rather than looking at sort of the constellation or the bundle of housing characteristics. We know that they can intersect in really important ways, and many families are trading one thing off for another thing. For example, they might find a stable living situation, but not in a safe neighborhood. Or they might find an affordable unit, but it has chipped paint and exposed wiring and leaks. And so there really are these trade-offs that families are facing constantly among these aspects of housing, and all of which, can really influence their kids' education. So if we go to the next slide, the efforts outlined in the housing chapter of Our Children Can't Wait come from recent studies that Urban and others have conducted in collaboration with housing authorities and national housing organizations and partnerships between housing and education sectors. And the goal of all this research has been to understand and support the work. So not to do hardcore evaluation at this point. These efforts are so new and they're really still innovating and figuring out what to do and how to do it. And the goal has been to share how these innovators are funding and staffing and structuring and measuring the success of these kinds of efforts. And one of the most important interventions is housing subsidies. That can't be too surprising. But some housing providers like Boulder Housing Partners or Tacoma Housing Authority actually have allocated units so housing units that they manage and allocate to different people, or their subsidies, meaning the dollars that they spend on housing to support their clients. Some of them have actually targeted housing assistance specifically to families with children. And so in those instances, they've really prioritized children with the goal of addressing housing quality, affordability, and stability, with the mind towards stabilizing those children and doing the best that they can to leverage that housing for the next generation. Another set of strategies is around leveraging housing for really enriched education. So this is kind of the idea of even within subsidized or assisted or more affordable housing communities, creating the kinds of amenities and enrichment that one might find in neighborhoods that have benefited from decades and decades of investment. And so those kinds of supports can, and Caitlin, if you could tap, yes, so those kind of supports can include things like case management, where when housing supports are allocated, that they come alongside with educational, like academic case management for children. And so that can really help to encourage families to think about the choices around homework and activities and time management and things that, and reading and things that might help them to support their learners at home. In some of these enriched housing environments, we're seeing more support for after school and summer learning. And so some apartment communities have really found the value in bringing in partners to support education right inside the building. And there's an organization called House Ed in California that actually encourages housing providers to get the highest quality programming in their developments that they can possibly get, what to look for, what to ask, and so really helps them to bring the right partners into their buildings. And then finally, there are a lot of efforts that support the youngest, littlest learners. So for example, the Akron Housing Authority runs an early childhood initiative that has actually built space for daycare and early learning programming, and provided home visiting services for families that are living there. So really making that very clear that this is a learning campus, and that these are situations in which the housing providers are really leveraging their role as housing providers to create and provide something a lot bigger than that. And then finally, innovators are also helping families with things like attendance issues and school choice decisions. And they are helping, they're exploring new opportunities to leverage the housing bundle. So there are some even more innovative things that have come along since we wrote these chapters. So that's really exciting. So then on the next slide, how do we make housing support the norm rather than the exception in education? And to start, we really need to allocate more funding for housing subsidies. This is so important. We need to serve more families with children. Right now, only 21% of households that are eligible for housing assistance get it. That means that 79% of households that are eligible for housing assistance do not get housing assistance. There's a huge amount of need out there. And so I think that, we really need to think about expanding our ability to support families with their housing. Secondly, we need to improve the physical condition of housing. So at this point, about a third of all owner and renter occupied housing is in need of repair. And we know that quality matters. And so we really need to think about how to make sure that homeowners and renters are living in high quality properties, and there needs to be dollars for that. And finally, we should be providing the resources that allows families to live in the communities that they would like to live in, even if that means higher rents. So that means that our subsidies should be a bit more flexible so that families whose communities do not have the kinds of enrichment that they would like their children to have should be able to live in those more enriched communities. And then finally, to wrap us up, we need to work together. And I think this book is a fantastic sort of call for that action from the education side. And I'm super excited about that. We really need more cross-sector collaboration at the federal, state, and local level. There are some really strong networks out there that are learning a lot about how to do this. But I think we really need some incentives and guidance from our government. And then we need to move beyond initiatives to sort of permanent policy intersections. So enough with the exploratory. Like, let's think about how we develop more of a commitment to supporting kids to have stable, high quality, affordable homes, so that they can focus on growing up and learning. So I will wrap it up for now. Thank you so much, and I look forward to discussing with you all.
Thank you, Megan. And I hopefully you have some new terminology. Megan has helped me think about the housing bundle, which I didn't have that language before. But as you saw on that great graph she showed, how student outcomes are directly related to that bundle around affordability, quality, and stability. And housing's always been an issue that's been tied to education, but I think more so than ever, if we know that 8 out of 10, as Megan just said, 8 out of 10 families who are eligible have an unmet need for housing. 8 out of 10. If you're an educator, a school board member, policymaker, hopefully today you walk away with some new tools, or maybe you're thinking more about housing in ways that you haven't before. So thank you, Megan, for starting us off with this conversation and thinking about going from housing to a broader context around the environment. So the school, the community, in school and community safety. Dr. Heather Reynolds and Dr. Ron Astor wrote this amazing chapter on kind of rethinking what we mean by safety. And Dr. Reynolds is going to lead us through kind of the nuggets from that chapter. And you'll see a lot of intersections, as Megan was using that language, intersections between both of these presentations. So take it away, Dr. Reynolds. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just so happy to be here today, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to provide a little context, sort of an introduction as to how Ron and I came to working on this chapter, which was just a great challenge, and I think we it led to a lot of really interesting discussions. But I think it's important that you know sort of where I'm coming from, which is I served as a Board of Education member in my community in upstate New York several years ago for a 3-year term as a teacher educator and somebody who has advocated and studied how to create welcoming and inclusive school environments. This seemed like a good way to give back to my community. And then Parkland happened. So there was a huge push from a very vocal, very well-organized group in our community to add more police immediately to K-12 schools in our district. The conversations were very heated, very divisive, and they were happening all over the country. It wasn't just in the district that I was in. So Ron and I started talking about this gap because Ron's created a lot of different programming around welcoming and inclusive schools, and sort of this gap between evidence-based programming and what conversations are going on at the local level. And it's sort of the idea that researchers can create these comprehensive school safety programs that show long-term positive impacts on all students, but local decision makers are sort of the gateway to implementing these programs. And so what does that mean? And it's certainly in my experience, and I speak of it in my experience, but I've also done a lot of work around this with local decision makers. With school safety, emotion and fear drive a lot of decisions at the local level, which I want to say is understandable. But there's also a history and a policy structure and sort of all these different things kind of come together to make it challenging to address what we really need to address. So with that, that's my very long-winded introduction. I will move to the next slide. And next point. Great. So in the United States, we have a long history of policing in schools that started with desegregation and really grew dramatically. There was the sort of SRO program, school resource officer, really began to receive an influx of funding in the 1990s, particularly after Columbine. And you'll note that I've made a couple of references to changes in policy and also funding as a result of a mass shooting. I mentioned Parkland, Columbine, Uvalde changed things again, where people became very focused on police in elementary schools, where that hadn't, I mean, we had Sandy Hook, but then Uvalde really moved that conversation. So we have police in schools. And it's interesting, the National Association for School Resource Officers, which is the national organization that does training, if training is required for school resource officers, they estimate there are about 20,000 plus or minus school resource officers in the United States in K-12 schools. They don't actually know because there is no registry. So we don't actually know how many SROs there are in schools in the United States. And the other piece is there were changes after Parkland about who was allowed to carry weapons on school campuses. Some states allow staff, including teachers, employees, to carry concealed weapons in school. There was the Guardian program in Florida that allowed people to do X amount of training and carry weapons in schools. So there are people who are also armed who are not active duty police officers. And we don't know those numbers. So one of the key issues in terms of social justice and equity is that policing in school has played a role in a long sort of history of disproportionate discipline that continues today. Students of color, particularly Black students, are much more likely to be receive punishment or removal from school than their white classmates. And also students with disabilities are much more likely to be the victim of punitive discipline, expulsion, suspension, than their non-disabled peers. So this is a very concerning aspect of school policing, among many other things. All of you probably have seen the recent CDC data, which is the first data we've seen post-pandemic. These concerns were certainly around before the pandemic, but they've continued to grow. I know working with teachers, the number one thing they talk about is just the social, emotional, and mental health challenges that kids are experiencing at all grade levels now that they're back in school and dealing with that sort of collective trauma. So the CDC data points to high rates of anxiety, hopelessness, suicidality, and certain subgroups that have been highlighted, such as teen girls, LGBTQ students. The rates of these of sadness, hopelessness is staggering. So if you haven't seen the CDC data, I would recommend looking at it. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, you can click one more time. Okay, I'm going to talk just for a minute about sort of who makes decisions about school safety practices and sort of where these, where sort of the structures and funding come from. At the state and federal level, funding continues to be primarily focused on security upgrades and policing in schools, again, through this Cops in Schools grant, funding SROs. And this is despite a lot of research that shows that these practices are expensive, generally not effective, and harmful for students of color and students with disabilities. And also at a time where we have students who are really struggling socially and emotionally, having police in schools, having a lot of visible security can also negatively impact the overall climate of the school. And at the local level, we have administrators and boards of education. And this was actually really interesting for me to learn. The board I was on was not diverse, but I'm not in a particularly diverse community. But if you look nationally, the National Association of School Boards did a survey in the last couple of years and looked at who were serving as board members and who the student population, K-12 student population was. The 90,000 Board of Education members in the United States, or over that, are mostly unpaid volunteers, which right off the bat knocks a lot of people out of content. Like, it makes it impossible for them to serve. They often do not look like or share the life experiences of the K-12 students and families that they represent. They're older, they're whiter, the vast majority actually don't have kids in school, and over half are retired. So these are the folks making decisions at the local level. And recently, the reason I'm trying to draw attention to this is we have issues of equity and we have issues of practices that don't work being utilized. So we need some structures and incentives for school safety researchers and for local decision makers to work collaboratively so that districts can use local data to identify and maintain sustainable safety solutions, and also so that they can regularly assess programming to see if it's effective, which surprisingly many school districts don't have the funding or support to do that. And also equity, like, are there issues in, a recent Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights published data 3 or 4 years ago about how many students were being suspended and expelled. In this area where I live in upstate New York, the rates were staggering when you looked at Black students versus white students in terms of how many times more likely they were to be suspended. Following that data, looking at that data, there has to be a structure to do that. The civil rights data came out. I haven't seen any data that's been out since 2018. I mean, we had the pandemic and everything else, but it's really important. It's really important we have that. Okay, and the last slide I will finish up. Okay, so in terms of recommendations, and again, there's a lot more in the chapter to this, but trying to summarize the key things. The evidence that we've found really points to the need for a seismic shift at the national, state, and local level, from a strong focus on school-based policing and security to data-driven, comprehensive, supportive, and non-punitive safety practices and policies. How can this be attained? We need flexible and sustainable funding streams. This was mentioned in the housing presentation. It's like, here's what we need, that allow districts to address their most pressing safety needs. Everyone doesn't have the same needs. And it's important to identify that. Otherwise, it's a waste of resources and money in schools where budgets are finite. It's not, we don't have unlimited funding. And the other piece is there seemed to be, and Ron and I talked a lot about this, a need for collaborative partnerships between districts and colleges and universities that gets people sort of talking about these issues at the teacher, principal, counselor preparation level. So there are better connections and structures to support districts. And this is sort of through professional development, through assistance with assessment and analysis of data. It's sort of a base to establish these relationships that hopefully will be long lasting and also helpful. If you are a researcher and you're developing programs that are impactful and show great potential, you want to have those in schools. And so this kind of collaborative work could make it easier to sort of have programming, appropriate programming, needed programming in schools. And finally, we need a commitment to assessing school safety programs regularly. I do some work now with some local schools and professional development organizations looking at how to assess social and emotional support. And sort of, there are so few schools that regularly assess programming. And in part, I mean, I think that it's easier to assess security. You can have somebody come in, you can call up, there's long-standing, and that's the other thing you sort of fight against, is these long-standing partnerships between local law enforcement and schools, where you can say, hey, you know, county sheriff, can you come in and just do a security check? And there's a checklist. It's not the same thing when you're talking about more complex, comprehensive programming. So that's the challenge. That requires resources, and again, incredibly important to identify and rectify systemic inequalities in school safety programming. So I will leave that at that, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. That was a great summary of your chapter. And again, we're talking about, if you join a little bit late, chapter 10 on housing as an education policy strategy. And the title of Heather Reynolds and Ron Astor's chapter is Reimagining School Safety During and After the Pandemic, a call for policy strategies to address racial and social justice. So Heather, what I heard you just say is that the irony of our policies and safety then they've actually, to a large degree, been harmful and made schools less safe in the United States, which is a point that I think, as you say, the seismic shift from a focus on policing and thinking about how school safety influences other conversations we're going to have around the juvenile justice system, and knowing that we serve the most more young people are detained in our country than any other nation. We spend $25 million a day detaining young people. And going back to housing and I'm thinking about how Megan had shared some thinking about the housing bundle around affordability, sustainability and quality, and how much that impacts notions or ideas of safety when we get to schools. So it was really appreciate both of you raising these issues. And I want to thank everybody for the questions you've been posing as we've been going. And if you haven't asked a question, I want to encourage you to please do so now, put it in the chat box. But there was a question that was raised. I'm going to direct it back over to Megan Gallagher from the Urban Institute. Megan, there was a question. Let me just read it verbatim. But the idea of How can developers create subsidized housing for families with systems impacted parents? Most federal subsidies prohibit subsidizing individuals with a background, which creates a barrier for these families to obtain quality, affordable housing. Could you say more or respond to that? Thank you.
Absolutely. I think this is a really great question. We see this challenge sometimes as well when we look at housing redevelopment efforts, that sometimes families who had been living together when they return to a newly redeveloped home after a housing program has sort of improved the quality of it, there will be particular family members that might make it difficult to join the lease. This is, I think, an issue area that I'm not particularly well versed in, but I do think that that there are really important state, potentially state and philanthropic funding sources that could fill the gap here. And of course, every time a unit is built, I think that the eligibility criteria for who can live in it can and should be discussed with the community. So I think that there are probably mechanisms for looking at this, but I'm not as aware of them as I probably could be. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Megan. There's a question asked just about McKinney-Vento and the housing urban development definition of homelessness, which Megan had responded to. And actually, Senator Feinstein had introduced a bill a few years ago that would make one common federal definition around student homelessness, because I think one of the big challenges that all of us have talked about in our chapters is, as our friends Alex Mays and Rochelle Davis described, the wrong pocket problem. So we might have an issue that we want to deal with, but the funding stream is coming from the wrong pocket, or it's so restrictive, like SROs, school resource officers, that schools can't access it, or communities can't access it, or even nonprofits are doing the work. Heather, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this wrong pocket problem when it comes to school and community safety, from your perspective as a scholar and now former school board member.
In terms of the funding streams, in terms of what's available.
Yeah. And I think you talked about how SROs are one of the few ways that schools can proactively get funding, but as you put it, as you shared, SROs actually can be harmful in school spaces.
Right. So there's nothing comparable to this. And again, the SRO program has, in the 1990s, it was Bill Clinton. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue. Joe Biden continues to fund SROs, especially after school shootings. There's a lot of pressure when these isolated events happen to respond with police and having police in schools. My community of 6,000 students, my school district, now has, we have virtually no violent crime in our community. We're suburban. We have 4 SROs at a cost of $500,000 a year now. We have 2 in the elementary schools, 1 in the middle school, 1 in the high school. That's money that's not going to other things, including, and it's money that's sort of, the government provides money to start and then the district needs to keep funding that. It's very hard to take police out of schools. It's much easier to put them in, but schools often don't have the funding. And there's a lot of research that shows how many schools actually have police and don't have a full-time nurse, or have ridiculous ratios between students and counselors. So it really has to start. I mean, there's local level work you can do, but the funding has to be more flexible. There's little glimpses, like the National School Climate Center has a survey, and there are some incentives, at least in the state of New York, for schools to do that survey. But then what they do with the results is like, it's just harder. It's more work, and schools don't have right this time. They don't have the time, they don't have the teachers feel like they don't have the place to do it. So it has to fundamentally be shifted to, this is what works. But it's very hard to convince people that a police officer in a school isn't going to protect their kid more than social and emotional learning. Did I answer that?
Yeah, no, those are great examples, and just highlighting the complexity, or sometimes the false sense of safety, or even, yeah, our dominant reaction is it's hard to move away from it, is what I hear you saying, Heather. Last question for both of you as we wrap up here. It's been as always, a really good conversation. For somebody who's new or hasn't thought of themselves as a housing advocate, Megan, or somebody who says, well, I've been an educator my whole life, but what do I do? Like, what's the immediate thing that you think folks can take away from this conversation today?
I can start just by saying, please be involved in your local district. If you look at school board elections, they're very contentious now. When I ran, no one really raised money. It was just like, sure, I'll run. And now there are national organizations backing local candidates, even in like irrelevant small districts. It's gotten really crazy. So advocate for things that kids need. We just had an article come out in the local paper about the issues of students saying very racist things in school to other students. A number of examples have been documented, and the school not doing anything. We have 4 school resource officers. So people need to decide what's important and advocate for that. There will always be people who will go and push for a certain political agenda, for a certain way of thinking about things. We have so much going on. If you can give your input at the local level, it can make a difference in those students' experiences. And it's particularly important that people speak up for those who cannot take the time to be at a school board meeting or take the time to write to the Board of Education, because it's not easy to be able to do those things. And it's important that we speak for those who also, who these policies and things impact most.
Thank you, Heather. Those are great suggestions for next steps. Megan, last but not least, what are your thoughts? The big takeaways for somebody who's new to this topic or your work?
So I think we all have a role to play in making sure that that housing doesn't limit children's ability to be children and to and to get the most out of the education that we can offer them. And to really think about your role in the commodification of housing. We allow the market, we allow homeowners to determine what gets built, where it gets built. And if we really care about students, we should care about the role that each of us plays in expanding or limiting the development, upkeep, and support for affordable housing.
So we have, we're rounding out here with a few minutes left. There were two great questions, and I'm wondering if, so Rosa had asked about in rural communities, what can we do differently? Frankly, as we think about both issues, especially housing. And then Michael had asked a question about kind of the pendulum shifting around, taking SROs out and then going to social emotional learning as a more prevention strategy, but then kind of the pendulum going back. So if you could actually share Heather and Megan, and we'll put this in the email, but in the follow-up email, but your emails to folks to have direct conversations with you. If you could put it in the chat box, that would be great. But those are really, those are great questions. And I think we could really probably spend quite a bit more time, but I do recognize there are several questions around rural issues specifically, that there are major capacity challenges we have, and the context is quite unique. So we have to think differently and creatively around policy solutions, and the one size fits all approach, which I think Megan and Heather have urged us to move away from, that absolutely does not apply to rural settings at all. And most policies tend to ignore rural communities altogether. But I'm going to wrap up here just to say thank you. I want to encourage everybody, if you can, purchase the book, purchase our book, read chapter 10 and 11, 10 on housing, 11 on safety. In the book, subscribe to the podcast, it's the name of the book and the podcast. Excuse me, sign up for our mailing list at UCLA, transformschools.ucla.edu, where you can sign up. You go to Our Children Can't Wait website as well, which has chapter summaries and information of all of the authors. It's amazing people. And I want to, again, give these dates where I said mark the calendar. April 19th, May 10th, and then also June 14th is coming up. So we have 3 more webinars. And I just want to thank you all you have limited time during the day. I want to thank you for committing your time, this conversation, and hopefully you feel inspired to move forward. And as we say over and over again, our children can't wait. The urgency of reinventing education policy in America is real. We have to move together, move in different ways. I want to thank our team at the Center for the Transformation of Schools for organizing today's conversation. Geneva Sum, Caitlin McAloon, Jacqueline Rodeo, Taylor Severa, thank you so much for your leadership. And we look forward to seeing you next month.